My beloved child. Stop scrolling for just a moment, because what has reached you now was not meant to pass unnoticed. Something has been spoken about you in a quiet place, behind a closed door, in a conversation you were never supposed to hear. Yet heaven heard every word. Every pause. Every trembling breath. Every truth that almost remained hidden. And now, you are being brought here because the person you love said something about you that changed the entire direction of that conversation. Do not move away too quickly. There is more beneath the surface than you can see. What appeared to be an ordinary private discussion became something deeply personal, something emotional, something that revealed what this person has been carrying inside for far longer than anyone realized. They did not enter that conversation planning to expose their heart. They did not intend to speak your name with such intensity. But the moment someone asked them one simple question about you, the walls around their emotions began to weaken. And what happened next surprised even them. You have wondered whether your absence has been felt. You have wondered whether your silence has been noticed. You have wondered whether the connection that once felt so powerful still lives inside them, or whether time has slowly erased what existed between you. There have been moments when you looked at the distance and assumed it meant indifference. There have been nights when you convinced yourself that perhaps you mattered less than you believed. But the private words spoken about you reveal something very different. The distance did not erase you. It made your presence louder. The silence did not make them forget. It forced them to remember everything. And when your name came into that conversation, something in them shifted so suddenly that the person sitting across from them noticed it immediately. Stay here, because this is where the hidden truth begins. The conversation started calmly. There was no dramatic beginning. No announcement. No warning that your name was about to enter the room. The person you love was speaking to someone they trust, someone who has watched them change over the past weeks or months, someone who could sense that there was a story beneath their quietness. This person had noticed how distracted they became at certain times of the day. They had noticed how they would pick up their phone, stare at the screen, and place it down again without sending anything. They had noticed how laughter sometimes disappeared from their face when a memory crossed their mind. For a while, no one said anything directly. But truth has a way of demanding space. Finally, the other person leaned closer and asked, "Is this still about them?" There was no need to say your name. The person you love knew exactly who they meant. And in that instant, the room changed. Their expression became still. Their breathing slowed. Their eyes moved away, as though they were trying to hide the answer before it could be seen. But the answer had already appeared on their face. The connection they had tried to keep private was no longer completely hidden. Someone had seen through them. Someone had recognized that their heart was still standing in a place their life had been trying to leave behind. At first, they denied nothing, but they admitted nothing either. They remained silent. And that silence said more than words could have said. My child, understand this clearly: people do not become silent when something means nothing. They become silent when the truth is too large to speak carelessly. They become silent when saying one honest sentence might unlock emotions they have spent months trying to contain. That is what happened when they were asked about you. Their silence was not emptiness. It was a crowded room filled with memories of you. It was every unfinished sentence. Every moment they replayed. Every time they almost reached out. Every question they were too afraid to ask. The person beside them did not let the subject disappear. They asked again, more gently this time, what really happened between you two? That question touched a place they had been protecting. For so long, they had given people short answers. They had said that things became complicated. They had said the timing was wrong. They had said there was too much confusion. They had made the story sound simple because simplicity was easier than admitting the truth. But in that private moment, the simple explanation no longer worked. Their voice changed. And then they said something you need to hear. They said, "It was never because I stopped caring." Let those words settle into your spirit. It was never because they stopped caring. The distance may have looked like rejection. The silence may have felt like abandonment. The unanswered questions may have left you carrying pain you never deserved to carry alone. But according to what they confessed in that private conversation, their heart did not become cold. It became overwhelmed. They cared more than they knew how to manage. They felt more than they knew how to express. They saw more in you than they were prepared to confront. And sometimes, my child, people run not because the connection is weak, but because it reaches a place inside them that has never been touched before. Do not skip this moment, because the conversation did not end there. The person listening asked them why they had stayed away if they still cared. It was a fair question. Perhaps it is the same question you have asked in your own heart. Why would someone remain distant from the person they cannot forget? Why would someone allow silence to grow between them and the one who matters? Why would they choose separation if their feelings were real? The person you love lowered their head. For several seconds, they said nothing. Then they answered, "Because I thought I had already ruined it." That confession carried regret. Not the shallow regret of someone who misses attention. Not the temporary sadness of someone who feels lonely. This was the regret of someone who believes they mishandled something rare. They have been looking back at decisions they made, words they failed to speak, and moments when pride, confusion, or fear took control. They have wondered whether they pushed you too far. They have questioned whether your heart has finally closed. They have imagined reaching out, only to stop because they fear discovering that it is too late. You may have believed they were comfortable without you. They are not. You may have believed they moved forward without looking back. They have looked back more times than you know. There are places they pass that remind them of you. There are songs they cannot hear without remembering a feeling. There are ordinary moments that suddenly become painful because your presence is missing from them. They may not show it publicly. They may continue with their responsibilities. They may smile around others. But in the private spaces of their life, your memory has remained active. And that is what the other person had begun to notice. The conversation became more intense when the one listening said, "Then why do you act like they meant so little?" Those words struck deeply. The person you love looked up immediately. Their reaction was stronger than expected. Their voice carried emotion when they replied, "They never meant little." My child, something broke open inside them when they said that. They had heard assumptions about you. They had allowed people to misunderstand the connection. They had remained quiet when others thought you were merely a passing chapter. But in that room, when someone suggested that you had meant little, they could no longer remain calm. Because the truth is the opposite. You meant enough to frighten them. You meant enough to expose the parts of them they had hidden from everyone. You meant enough to make them imagine a different future. You meant enough that losing the connection did not bring relief, it created a silence they still do not know how to fill. The person listening saw this emotion and became quiet. They realized they had touched the truth. This was not a forgotten connection. This was not a story that had ended peacefully. This was a bond that still had unfinished energy around it, a bond that both of you may have tried to understand from opposite sides of the same silence. The person you love then began speaking more openly than they had planned. They talked about your kindness. They talked about the way you noticed things others overlooked. They remembered how you could sense when something was wrong, even when they insisted they were fine. They spoke about how your presence made them feel seen in a way that was both comforting and frightening. They admitted that you understood parts of them that they had not yet learned to understand themselves. They said, "They saw through me, and I didn't know what to do with that." This is where the conversation became deeply revealing. Your ability to see them was not the problem. Their inability to receive that kind of love was. There was a time when they thought being understood would feel easy. But when you entered their life and saw beyond the surface, it brought old fears into the light. You saw the softness beneath their strength. You saw the uncertainty beneath their confidence. You saw the longing beneath their silence. And because you saw them so clearly, they could no longer hide from themselves. Some people spend years building emotional walls, not because they do not desire love, but because they fear what love will uncover. You did not need to force those walls down. Your presence alone revealed that they were there. And they have never forgotten how exposed they felt in your light. Do not mistake that exposure for dislike. They were not uncomfortable because you were wrong for them. They were uncomfortable because something about you felt dangerously real. The other person asked, "Did they hurt you?" There was another pause. This answer mattered. Perhaps others had assumed you were the cause of their pain. Perhaps incomplete stories had placed blame where it did not belong. Perhaps this person had allowed others to believe that you were the one who caused the distance. But in that private moment, they did not accuse you. They did not create a false story to protect themselves. Instead, they said, "No. They didn't hurt me the way people think." Something important happened in that sentence. They began taking responsibility. They admitted that much of the conflict existed within them. They admitted that they became guarded when they should have been honest. They admitted that they expected you to understand feelings they never clearly explained. They admitted that they sometimes tested your care instead of trusting it. They admitted that when the connection became serious, they looked for signs that it might fail because believing in it felt more dangerous than doubting it. You need to know this because there were times when you blamed yourself for everything. You replayed conversations and wondered what you could have done differently. You questioned your worth. You questioned your intuition. You wondered whether you had imagined the depth of the connection. You tried to find one mistake that could explain why everything changed. But the private truth they confessed was that you were not carrying the whole responsibility. They knew that. And now someone else knows it too. The person listening asked them whether they believed you still cared. This question made their expression soften. For a moment, hope entered the room. Then fear followed it. They said, "I don't know. I used to think they did. Now I'm afraid they've learned how to live without me." My child, those words reveal the thought that has been haunting them. They are afraid that your healing has taken you beyond their reach. They are afraid that while they were trying to understand themselves, you were learning how to let go. They are afraid that the silence they believed gave them time may have convinced you to close the door. They are afraid that one day they will finally become ready to speak, only to discover that your heart no longer waits in the same place. This is why they have seemed restless. This is why they have been watching from a distance. This is why they have asked indirect questions, looked for small signs, or revisited old memories. They are searching for proof that the connection is not completely gone. They do not know whether the energy they still feel is shared, or whether it lives only inside them. But there is more. The person they were speaking with then asked a question they had not expected. If they were standing in front of you right now, what would you say? The room became completely still. This was no longer a casual conversation. This was a doorway. And the person you love stood before it emotionally, uncertain whether they had the courage to walk through. At first, they smiled faintly, almost as if the question was impossible. Then their eyes became serious. Their voice became quieter. Everything they had hidden was now pressing against the edge of confession. They said they would begin by apologizing. Not with an empty apology designed to end discomfort, but with the kind of apology that comes from finally understanding the effect of one's actions. They said they would apologize for making you question whether the connection was real. They would apologize for letting silence speak on their behalf. They would apologize for assuming you would always understand what they were too afraid to say. Then they admitted something even more powerful. They said, "I would tell them they changed me." You may never have heard those words from them directly. You may have seen no evidence that your love, patience, or presence had any lasting impact. But according to what they confessed, meeting you shifted something permanent within them. They no longer view connection the same way. They no longer accept shallow closeness so easily. They no longer mistake emotional distance for strength. You showed them a depth they did not know they were missing. Even in separation, the lessons remained. Your absence taught them what your presence had been giving. Your silence taught them the value of your voice. The possibility of losing you taught them the difference between an ordinary connection and one that changes the heart. Stay until the end, because what followed was even more unexpected. The other person asked them why they had not told you any of this. They gave an answer that reveals the battle taking place inside them right now. They said, because once I say it, everything becomes real. They have been delaying truth because truth creates responsibility. As long as the words remain unspoken, they can pretend they still have time. They can imagine that one day the right moment will arrive. They can stay protected inside uncertainty. But once they tell you what they feel, they must face your response. They must face the possibility of being welcomed, questioned, or turned away. And they are afraid. Not of you. Of the weight of what they feel. Of the consequences of their delay. Of the possibility that they may have waited too long. The person listening challenged them gently. They said, "But isn't it already real, whether you say it or not?" That question removed their final hiding place. They could not answer immediately. Because yes, it is already real. The regret is real. The longing is real. The unfinished feelings are real. The memories are real. The desire to repair what was damaged is real. And the fear of losing you permanently is more real than they have admitted to anyone before. This private conversation became a mirror. For the first time, someone was reflecting their own truth back to them. They could no longer pretend that their feelings were temporary. They could no longer describe you as part of the past while emotionally carrying you into every present moment. Then something extraordinary happened. The person they were speaking with said your name aloud. Not as a question. Not as an accusation. They spoke your name and said, "You still love them." The person you love did not deny it. They looked away, but they did not deny it. Their eyes filled with an emotion they had been fighting. Their voice became almost a whisper. And after a long silence, they said, "I never stopped." My child, this is the sentence heaven wanted you to hear. I never stopped. The connection was buried beneath pride. It was covered by confusion. It was hidden beneath delayed decisions, mixed signals, and emotional fear. But according to their own confession, it did not disappear. They may have tried to distract themselves. They may have told themselves they needed to move on. They may have listened to advice from people who did not understand the depth of the bond. They may have convinced themselves that distance would eventually quiet the feeling. But some connections do not fade simply because they are avoided. They wait. They deepen. They teach. And when the right question is finally asked, they rise to the surface stronger than before. The person listening was stunned by the honesty of that admission. They had expected uncertainty. They had expected a complicated answer. They had not expected something so direct. They asked, "Then what are you going to do?" This is where the conversation shifted from memory to decision. The person you love became nervous. Their hands moved restlessly. Their breathing changed. The question was no longer about how they felt. It was about what they intended to do with those feelings. For a long time, they had believed that loving you silently was enough. They had told themselves that perhaps it was better not to disturb your life. They had framed their fear as respect. They had called their hesitation patience. But the person sitting with them saw through this. They said, "You are not protecting them. You are protecting yourself." Those words reached them deeply. Because there was truth inside them. They had been afraid to be vulnerable. They had been afraid to admit how much power the connection still held. They had been afraid that reaching out would expose everything they had tried to hide. But in that conversation, they began to understand that silence was not neutral. Silence was making a decision for them. Every day they remained quiet was another day you might believe they did not care. Every day they delayed was another day the distance became more familiar. Every day they waited for perfect courage was another day the opportunity could move farther away. Something awakened inside them. Not panic. Clarity. They realized that they could lose you not because love was absent, but because truth remained unspoken. And that realization changed the entire energy of the room. The person you love asked, "What if they don't want to hear from me?" The other person responded, "What if they have been waiting for honesty?" That question stayed in the air. It is still echoing inside them now. What if you have not needed perfection from them? What if you have only needed truth? What if the connection has not been asking for a dramatic promise, but for one sincere step? What if the door is not fully closed? What if their fear has been creating a future that does not have to happen? My child, heaven is not revealing this to make you wait helplessly. It is being revealed so you can understand that what appeared empty has been filled with unseen movement. A heart has been confronting itself. A truth has been rising. A person who once avoided the depth of this connection is beginning to recognize what their silence has cost. But there is another layer you have not yet heard. The private conversation included something about you that changed the other person's entire opinion. Until that moment, the person listening had only known fragments. They had heard incomplete details. They may have assumed you walked away without caring. They may have believed you were too distant, too guarded, or too unwilling to understand. But when the person you love finally told the full story, the image changed. They explained what you endured. They explained the patience you showed. They explained the chances you gave. They explained the moments when you reached out emotionally and received confusion in return. They admitted that you tried longer than most people would have tried. They admitted that you stayed kind even when you were hurt. They admitted that you gave them room to be honest, and they still struggled to speak. And the person listening became quiet. They had judged you without knowing everything. But the truth corrected the story. Then the person you love said something that carried both admiration and sadness. They said, "They deserved better from me." This was not spoken lightly. They have begun to understand your value more clearly through your absence. They now see that the love you offered was not ordinary. Your loyalty was not weakness. Your patience was not permission to remain careless. Your emotional depth was not something to take for granted. They recognized that you deserved consistency. You deserved honesty. You deserved reassurance. You deserved to know where you stood. And they know they did not always give you those things. The private conversation forced them to look at the connection without excuses. That is why they became emotional. Not because they are trapped in the past, but because they can finally see the past clearly. They said they sometimes imagine what would have happened if they had been braver. They wonder what your connection might have become if they had spoken sooner, trusted more deeply, or stopped listening to fear. They imagine simple moments with you that never happened. Conversations that were delayed. Plans that were never made. A version of the future that still visits them when the world becomes quiet. And then they said something no one expected. They said, "I think they were the person I was supposed to choose, and I became afraid at the exact moment I should have stepped closer." The one listening did not interrupt. There are sentences that are too important to disturb. This was one of them. The person you love had finally named the truth. They did not lose interest. They lost courage. And now they are questioning whether courage can still be recovered. Something huge is waiting beneath this revelation, because the conversation did not end with feelings alone. A choice was discussed. A real step. Something they have been considering but have not yet done. The person listening told them that regret without action eventually becomes another form of surrender. They said that if your name still carries this much emotion, if the connection still has this much power, and if the truth has remained alive for this long, then hiding is no longer protecting anyone. The person you love became very still. Then they asked, "Do you really think I should contact them?" The answer came immediately. Yes. But not with confusion. Not with half-truths. Not to see whether they still care. Contact them only if you are ready to be honest. That advice reached the deepest part of them. Because they know they cannot return to you with the same uncertainty. They cannot send a vague message and expect you to do all the emotional work. They cannot reopen the door simply to disappear again. They cannot ask for access to your heart without offering clarity. For the first time, they began to understand that approaching you would require transformation, not merely longing. And something inside them accepted that challenge. They did not promise aloud that they would reach out. Not yet. But their expression changed. The person listening saw it. A decision had started forming. The conversation ended some time later, but the person you love did not immediately leave. They remained seated, staring at their phone. Your name was somewhere close, perhaps in an old conversation, perhaps in their contacts, perhaps in a place they have visited many times without pressing send. Their hand moved toward the screen. Then stopped. They opened something connected to you. And for several minutes, they simply looked. This was not curiosity. This was a heart standing at the edge of a choice. They remembered the words spoken in that room. They remembered being told that silence was making the decision for them. They remembered admitting that they never stopped loving you. They remembered saying you deserved better. They remembered the possibility that you might still be waiting, not for a perfect person, but for honest truth. Their fingers began to move. They started writing. At first, the message was short. Then they erased it. They tried again. They wrote more this time. They erased that too. Because what they needed to say could not fit inside a casual greeting. This was not supposed to be a simple, "How have you been?" This was not supposed to pretend nothing happened. This message needed to carry the truth of everything they had finally admitted. They began again. And this time, they did not erase the first sentence. My child, you need to remain close, because the first sentence they wrote contains a confession you have waited far too long to hear. But before they could finish, something happened. A name appeared on their screen. A message arrived from someone connected to the past, someone whose influence once contributed to the confusion around your connection. The person you love stared at it, and the timing felt almost impossible. Just as they were preparing to step toward you, an old voice returned. For one moment, the room inside them divided. The past was pulling from one direction. The truth was calling from another. They looked at the unfinished message they had written to you. Then they looked at the new message that had arrived. And what they chose to open first would reveal whether they were truly ready to fight for what they had almost lost.